The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
Through an Angolan minefield, her dancing with John Travolta at the White House. They know the heartbreak, the scandal, and the tragedy of that Paris tunnel in August 1997. But here is what most people do not know. When Diana sat down at her desk in Kensington Palace in the summer of 1996 and quietly picked up her pen, she was not simply signing paperwork. She was making a decision so precise, so deliberate, and so quietly explosive that it would shake the foundations of the British monarchy for decades to come. She left her estate, her money, her memories, her jewels, her voice, not to a senior royal advisor, not to a palace-approved attorney, not even primarily to her sons. She left control of everything to one man, her butler. And when the full picture of that decision came into focus, the trusts, the charities, the hidden clauses, it became clear that Diana had not simply written a will. She had planned a revolution, one that would outlast her by 30 years and possibly much longer. This is the story of what Diana really did with her legacy and why it changed everything. To understand why Diana made the choices she did, you first have to understand who she truly was, not the icon on the magazine cover, but the woman underneath. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House on the Sandringham estate. She grew up at Althorpe, surrounded by aristocratic tradition and old English grandeur, but her childhood was fractured. Her parents' marriage collapsed when she was just 7 years old, and the divorce was bitter and public by the standards of the time. That early wound, the feeling of abandonment, of being left behind by the people who were supposed to protect her, never fully healed. She was working as a kindergarten teaching assistant when she caught the attention of Prince Charles. She was 20 years old. He was 32. The courtship was brief, the pressure immense, and on July 29, 1981, she walked down the aisle at St. Paul's Cathedral in an ivory silk gown with a 25-foot train, and the world gasped with delight. But behind the palace doors, Diana was already struggling. Charles had never fully ended his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana later said she could feel Camilla's presence even before the wedding day. The isolation of royal life set in fast. The palace expected composure. Diana was full of feeling. She developed bulimia nervosa, a battle she fought privately for years, and only later spoke about publicly with extraordinary courage. By 1992, the illusion was beyond repair. The Camillagate tapes, recordings of intimate phone calls between Charles and Camilla, were published. The formal separation was announced that same year. 2 years later, Charles publicly admitted the affair in a televised interview. Then came the moment that changed everything. In November 1995, Diana sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for a BBC Panorama interview that drew an audience of 22 million people in the United Kingdom alone. She was calm, measured, and devastating. She spoke about the loneliness, the bulimia, the affairs, including her own relationship with cavalry officer James Hewitt, and she delivered one of the most quoted lines in royal history, saying she wanted to be a queen in people's hearts. That interview was not just a confession. It was a declaration of independence. The palace was furious. Queen Elizabeth II wrote to both Charles and Diana urging an early divorce. Diana's HRH title was stripped. She was, in the most formal sense, being pushed out. But what the institution failed to understand was that Diana had already found something far more powerful than a royal title. She had found her purpose, and with it, she had found her audience. While the marriage crumbled around her, Diana was quietly doing something extraordinary. She was changing the world. In 1987, at a time when fear and stigma around HIV and AIDS was at its peak, Diana visited the HIV/AIDS ward at the Middlesex Hospital in London. She sat with patients. She held their hands, without gloves, and she smiled. At a moment when many public figures refused to be photographed anywhere near an AIDS patient, the most photographed woman on earth was sitting bedside, offering dignity to people the world had decided to forget. The impact was immediate and lasting. Nurses reported that the visit transformed how patients were treated within days. Researchers noted a measurable shift in public perception. Diana did not give a speech. She did not issue a statement. She simply showed up and showed the world what compassion looked like. In January 1997, she went further. Dressed simply in jeans and a flak jacket, Diana walked through an active minefield in Wombo, Angola. The photographs of her carefully picking her way through the cleared corridor, surrounded by the markers of landmines just feet away, were published around the world within hours. Governments were embarrassed. Politicians who had stalled on mine ban treaties were suddenly under pressure. By December of that year, the Ottawa Treaty, formerly known as the Mine Ban Treaty, had been signed by 122 nations. By 2023, more than 164 countries had ratified it, and an estimated 55 million landmines had been destroyed. Diana's walk through that Angolan field did not single-handedly end the landmine crisis, but it cracked open the conversation in a way that decades of diplomatic lobbying had failed to do. She worked with leprosy patients in Indonesia. She held orphans in Zimbabwe. She visited the homeless in London shelters. At every turn, she chose the people the system had overlooked, and she looked them directly in the eye. The palace was not always supportive. Charles is reported to have privately dismissed her charity work as attention-seeking. Diana did not stop. She understood something her critics did not, that in the age of mass media, attention was the most powerful currency available, and she was willing to spend it on the people who needed it most. By the time her divorce was finalized in August 1996, Diana had become something the monarchy had never produced before, a global humanitarian figure whose moral authority came not from her bloodline, but from her actions. She was free, and she was thinking very carefully about what came next. It was the summer of 1996. The divorce papers had been signed. Her HRH status was gone. But Diana still had something the palace could not take away: her estate, her name, and her say over how both would be used after she was gone. She sat at her mahogany desk in Kensington Palace, photographs of William and Harry watching from the shelf. She was 35 years old. She had survived a failed marriage, relentless press scrutiny, eating disorders, depression, and the full weight of institutional hostility. And now she was writing her will. This was not a routine legal exercise. For Diana, it was her final act of authorship, the last document in which she alone would have the only vote. The estate was substantial. The divorce settlement had delivered around £17 million. There were book advances, jewelry, art, and her interest in Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire. She divided it with extraordinary care. 75% of her personal estate would go to a portfolio of charitable causes she had championed throughout her life: AIDS research, landmine clearance initiatives, children's organizations, and the homeless. This was not a vague gesture toward generosity. It was a structural commitment built into the legal architecture of the will to ensure that her money kept doing her work long after she was gone. 25% went into protected trusts for William and Harry. The funds were ring-fenced, professionally managed, and structured so that neither the palace nor any outside influence could redirect them. Diana wanted her sons to have security and independence. She was also, quietly, ensuring that they would never be entirely financially dependent on the institution that had hurt her so deeply. And then came the appointment that would define the will's legacy more than anything else. She named Paul Burrell as executor. Burrell had served as Diana's butler for 10 years. He was not a lawyer, not a royal advisor, not a peer of the realm. He was the man who had brought her tea in the morning, who had kept her confidences, who had been present during some of the darkest and most private moments of her life. He knew her handwriting, her fears, her habits, and her hopes in a way that no palace official ever had. By naming him executor, Diana was making a statement as much as a legal appointment. The person in charge of her legacy would be someone whose loyalty was to her, not to the institution, not to the family, not to tradition. To her. She reportedly wept quietly as she signed each page and told Burrell, "This is my last chance to be free." The palace lawyers were already circling. There were whispered conversations about instability and amendments. Diana did not waver. Her hand was steady. Her mind was made up. She had written her final chapter. When Diana's will became public knowledge after her death in August 1997, the reaction inside Buckingham Palace was one of barely concealed alarm. A butler, a servant, was in charge of one of the most closely watched estates in the world. He had the legal authority to sell Diana's jewelry, manage her charitable trusts, distribute her personal effects, and decide which stories about her reached the public and which did not. He could, in effect, control the narrative. And that is precisely what he did. The jewels alone were staggering in their significance. Diana's sapphire and diamond engagement ring, the 12-carat Ceylon sapphire that would later pass to Catherine, Princess of Wales, was only one piece among dozens of extraordinary items. A Saudi sapphire ring valued at around £500,000 was eventually sold at auction, with proceeds directed toward Elton John's AIDS Foundation, extending Diana's charitable reach even in the act of selling her possessions. Burrell's handling of the estate was not without controversy. In 2002, he was charged with stealing 310 items from Diana's estate, including letters, clothing, and personal mementos. The trial became a media spectacle unlike anything seen since the divorce itself. Then, dramatically, the charges were dropped when it emerged that Queen Elizabeth II had been told by Burrell, shortly after Diana's death, that he was keeping certain items for safekeeping. The case collapsed. Burrell walked free, and he walked out with Diana's story still in his hands. In 2003, he published A Royal Duty, a memoir in which he shared details of Diana's private correspondence and her personal wishes. The royal family's response was swift and furious. Charles reportedly described it as a betrayal. Harry, in his own memoir published 20 years later, echoed similar sentiments about the exposure of his mother's private world. But there was another dimension to Burrell's role that received far less attention: his quiet stewardship of Diana's charitable legacy. Under his management as executor, the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund was established and began distributing millions of pounds to causes she had championed. AIDS organizations received significant funding at a critical time. Landmine clearance charities were supported. Children's hospices received grants that kept their doors open. Every auction, every memoir entry, every carefully released photograph was, depending on your perspective, either a commercialization of grief or the continuation of a very deliberate plan. The truth, as it almost always is with Diana, is more complicated than either verdict. And then there is the part of Diana's estate that almost nobody talks about. Buried within the legal structure of her will, hidden in plain sight within documents that were technically available but practically impenetrable to anyone without specialist knowledge, was a provision that royal watchers and investigative journalists would spend years trying to understand. It has come to be called the Shadow Trust. According to those who have examined the estate documents most closely, Diana set aside a separate pool of funds, reportedly in the region of £2 million, with instructions that it be used to support causes that, in the